All right. So we are really excited to have today's Marana digital expert here with us today. Her name is Neema, and she's calling in from Berlin, but working with groups in Uganda. And she'll be speaking today about inclusive design and how this works for women's support organizations across the continent. So Neema, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself to everyone.
Thank you so much. Can you all see my slides? Yeah, super. All right, thanks, Faye. Thanks so much for having me. And hi, everyone else. I'm really happy to be here and to meet all of you. So the plan is that I'll talk for about 20 to 30 minutes and then open it up for discussion. So I've been invited today to talk about how do we rethink design that includes everyone. So I'm going to be talking about our work that we do at the intersection of data, design, and technology. So getting started. So first of all, who am I? I'll give you a brief introduction. As Faye mentioned, my name is Neema Iyer. I am an artist, a technologist, and a podcaster. I am the founder of Pollicy, which is a civic technology organization based in Kampala, Uganda. And at Pollicy, we work at the intersection of data, design, and technology. We do a lot of work on researching data, on building data products, and on building data capacity because we believe that everyone should have access to the internet and everyone should be able to use digital tools, to better their lives, to better their communities. I also do art and I combine my love of tech and art, as I will show you. And I also podcast on tech and art. So it's all very interconnected. So first of all, I just wanted to talk about the design landscape. So I wanted to talk about what are some of the pressing issues in design. So first of all, I think, many of us already know this, but access to digital platforms still remains a major challenge. The gender digital divide in sub-Saharan Africa is among the highest. I think it was 41% in 2019. So a lot of people remain disconnected from the internet, and that burden is particularly high for women. And so, whenever we think about designing a digital tool, for example, like if you do an online survey, for example, we just had a project with Facebook and they collect a lot of data from participants, but then you have to ask if about half of women across Africa do not use the internet, then what does that say about the quality of the data that you have? So when I talk about access, it's also not just access to the internet, but it's also how accessible is whatever your product is. So, for example, is whatever you're building accessible to somebody who has a disability? So, somebody who might not be able to see, somebody who might not be able to hear, or somebody who just has poor eyesight, for example. Like if you're building a digital product, are you building something that takes into account the needs of different types of people? So, that's the first thing that I want to look at is how do people access different types of content, whether it's online or offline? How do you reach people, and how do you make sure that whatever you do develop and that can actually reach people is actually accessible? The second point, when building inclusive products, is thinking about language, because there's of course so many different languages and people come from different places. And I know when people build products across Africa that they tend to be quite hyper localized. So just because some of our governments have very restrictive laws, it's not always easy to scale whatever you're building out of your country. So sometimes you might just focus on a language in your own country, but by extending the number of languages that you offer, for example, you might be able to find a bigger market or find people who speak different dialects. So I think it's very important to think about not just which language you use, but also your platform, your product, your content. The third thing I wanted to talk about is medium. So it's worth thinking about how exactly are you planning to reach your users? And of course, I think all of you come from very different backgrounds or building different products or different organizations. And this is one of the things that I think is interesting to consider, because if you think about access and language, that can determine what kind of medium you use. So for example, are you using like an online platform? Are you using videos? Are you using images? What kind of medium are you using to ensure that the people that you're trying to reach can be reached? So I think that that requires quite a lot of thought in terms of who your end users are, and then what kind of medium you use to reach them. And then the fourth bit that I wanted to talk about is safety. So I think this is one of the things that often gets neglected when people build different types of products. So you can see in the form of technology products, when Facebook, Twitter, Google, they were very focused on scaling and building products, but they didn't really focus as much as they should have, and how do you keep users on these platforms safe. So now we're seeing explosions of disinformation, online violence against women. These tools are being used for different reasons, such as surveilling women's bodies and getting people in trouble. So for example, I'll give you a very simple example here, where I used to work for this company that was called VOTO Mobile. It's now called Viamo. And we used to develop content that you could share via your simple mobile cell phone. And we had developed a mama program, which is a very basic 9-month program where you provide information to expectant mothers on what stage of the pregnancy they're in and what they could expect. But what ended up happening was that the woman would receive their phone calls, and then the men, their partners, would become quite angry, asking who is calling you all the time, who are these messages from. And so when they developed the program, they didn't involve men in the program. And this program was mainly for women in rural areas. And so because of that design, men were basically either, becoming quite violent or getting angry or taking the phone away from the woman. And that's just an example to show you that you have to design your programs in such a way that you really look at how to keep your end users safe. So this is of course something that we didn't foresee happening, and that's something we don't hope would happen. But sometimes even when you have the best intentions, you can build something that doesn't take into account different people's needs. Because perhaps if you live in an urban area, you say, oh, I'm an independent woman, nobody controls me. But then you're developing products that different groups might use. And if it's people, from low resource settings who, for example, don't even have their own cell phone, they borrow somebody's cell phone, and then what kind of content are you sharing with them? So these are kind of the things that you have to think about in terms of putting yourself in other people's perspectives, and really looking for all the possible risks that could happen, because some of them just don't even make sense. You would never imagine it would happen, and then yet you see it happening. So it's really about talking to different people, understanding what context they're coming from, and then building appropriately. So I wanted to give you some examples of the work that we do. So we use a lot of art and design in our work. And our work at Pollicy is really focused on data and understanding how data is used, how data is governed, how data is researched. So some of this discourse can be quite jargony, it can be quite academic, but we want this information to be accessible to as many people as possible. Because, for example, when you think about something like artificial intelligence, a lot of the discourse is dominated by Western countries, and very few people on the African continent are tackling this issue as it impacts people in Africa. And it's because this thematic area has been, it's very niche, like very few people in academia, a few civil societies are working on it. But I feel like these discussions should be democratized, so everyone should know about what's happening and should have a say in what our technological future looks like. So I'll give you a few examples. So this is one project we have, which is called Afro-Feminist Data Futures. And in this project, we wanted to understand how are feminist movements across Africa using data to further their movements. Because one of the things we saw is that nobody had done this kind of research. We didn't know previously what were the challenges, what were the barriers, and what are the opportunities. And so this research was funded by Facebook, because Facebook wanted to know how they can support African organizations, because they have a data for good program. And so through this research, we talked to about 40 feminist organizations from all over the continent. And now we're better able to understand what are the issues, and there are many, many issues. So you can read that report. And one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to use bright imagery to pull people into, to basically read the report. Because most people don't want to read a long report. So it's all about trying to figure out, okay, we have this information, we have this knowledge, we want to share it with people, and we want people to engage back with us and to think about this information and to build on it. So if we've put this work out there and we've identified 10 challenges and 10 recommendations, it's not that we want to work on solving those challenges. We want everyone to come together and use that information to go on and do work in their sectors. So, but then how do you first bring people into the conversation? Because if somebody is working on, for example, hygiene and sanitary napkins for girls, they might not think that they need data and they might not want to read something like this. But then but that information definitely applies to them because they must know like how many people need these products, what are their challenges, how do you conduct research, how do you measure your impact. And so that's kind of where I'm going with this, that if you can use art and design in your work, then you might be able to bring different audiences in to engage with that. The next project we had is using games. So of course, all of us hear about fake news, we hear about disinformation, but then I feel like a lot of people don't go one step further in exploring that as a topic. So one of the things we wanted to see is like, can we use a combination of games and storytelling to engage with people on the topic of disinformation? Because most of the information is like in long texts and wordy, and a lot of people don't have the attention span, as I said. So in this game we wanted to use imagery of African people. First of all, like we thought that that was really important, that in this game that we have images of what our target audiences look like, and that we also have stories that apply to our context. So if you read about fake news that's going on in the US, there's a storming of the US Capitol or whatever is happening. I mean, that might feel very far removed, but if we can contextualize it and design the product in such a way that people can relate to that specific content, then maybe we can pull them in and have this discussion on fake news. So we developed this game where you can play as one of these three characters, and they have different stories and you have to make different choices. And based on the choices you make, you get different outcomes. And the whole point of that game was that we want people to understand how, every time you forward a message, that it can have consequences. So it's basically like just think before you share information. And the game wasn't really trying to tell people like what is right or wrong, but just to give people the idea that, small actions that you take can have big consequences when it comes to disinformation. So this is an example of how we use design, we used art, and we used technology to bring more people into this discourse about a growing problem such as disinformation. The next project we had was called Create Your Kampala, and this was a project for people who are not in digital spaces. So, a lot of people ask us, for example, okay, but 50% of women are not online, so how are you going to engage with them if all your products are online? And so in this project, we went to 5 different communities in Kampala, and we surveyed about 1,000 people. So we spoke to 1,000 people from across the city, and then we brought together their local government leaders, and we developed these artworks together with the communities, where we asked them questions about service delivery. So how do you see service delivery in your community? We brought the community together with leaders to discuss like what could be solved, what are the issues. And based on that, we took this data and we created artworks across the communities that people then felt that they had an ownership over. And we also recruited young people from the communities to help us make these artworks so that they felt that it was something that they created as well. So in this way, we combined their data with these artworks so that they can engage their local government on these issues. This was another really fun project we had. So it's called The Price is Wrong, and it's a 3-part mockumentary. So it's short in the style of a documentary, but it's just acting. It's not a real story. But we wanted to talk to people about digital security in your day-to-day life. So, not like you're like some cyber expert and you're hacking into government systems, but like very simple ways that people, face digital security issues. So like in this story, this woman takes part in this competition and then her mobile money gets stolen because she reveals her password in the question. So it's just trying to use humor to get people to think about their digital security in different ways. So for example, like what is a VPN? Why should you protect your password? Why, you should maybe not share devices, those kinds of things. And so that was really fun to work with. And we were trying to use a different media. As I said before, we didn't want it to be a report. We didn't want it to be a PDF or a PowerPoint. We really wanted it to be something you could just share on WhatsApp with your friends and then, sit down and watch it for 10 minutes when you have some time. And that way there's something that you learn. So just trying to think out of the box about how you can reach different types of audiences using different type of media. And then here's another tool that we use. So we used a chatbot, which is a conversational kind of automated response. I'm sure many of you have interacted with them. And we used a chatbot to share one of our reports. So we did a big research across Africa looking at online violence against women. So we did that research in 5 countries and we produced a 10,000 word report. But again, we wanted people to engage with the content in a different way. So we thought, what if we share the findings in the format of a chatbot? So you interact with the chatbot, and then the chatbot gives you different parts of the report. And then within 5 minutes, you don't feel like you've read a report, but then you still get all the information that's in the report. So that was quite, I think a lot of people found it quite more interesting than just picking up the PDF and reading it. And chatbots are a really fun way to, in general, share different types of information in a way that seems more human, I guess. It doesn't feel like you're interacting that much with the computer, and it feels a bit more conversational and more open, and you have more choices in determining what kind of content you do see. So I really love using chatbots. I think they're fun media. So definitely, if you have the chance, try it out. And so, yeah, so I think it's worthwhile to seeing what are some of the opportunities out there. So I've already given you some examples, but I will give you some more examples on how we can develop inclusive design. And I picked a couple of examples. So as I mentioned before with the example of Viamo, so they use interactive voice response, which is, anytime you call your bank and you hear like an automated message on the phone, that's basically interactive voice response. So it allows you as a caller to interact with, a back end of the phones and receive different types of information. So one of their flagship projects is called 321, and you can call a number for free and you can get different types of information. So depending on your country, you could get health information, you could get weather, you could get the news, you could get stories. And the best part is you don't need a smartphone, you can use any type of phone and all the content is free. But you can also develop many kinds of interesting products. Like one of the ones that I really like is you can, kind of like the game that I showed you guys, you can play the same kind of game on your phone in local languages. So the first thing that you do is you would pick which language you speak, and then all your messages are in that local language. And then you can interact back and forth with the system and receive different types of messages. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm happy to elaborate if you have questions on that. But what I really like about this is, if you think about the first slide that I showed, in terms of access, so anyone with access to a phone can access this content. You don't need to have mobile data. You can call it for free. It's localized, so the content is often in local languages. And that opens doors to reaching much more people than just people, for example, who speak English or French. And you can use it on your own time. So you can call the line when you want, and it's more of an on-demand service instead of the line calling you. So that was one of the issues with the Mama program, was that the phone would call you and give you the message. But there's of course the possibility where you call the number at your own time when you're in a private place, and you can listen to different types of content. So I really like how the media is something that's accessible, that people can relate to, because I think humans are very prone to storytelling. So I really like what kind of products you can develop on this and reach different types of markets. So another project that I think is quite interesting is one that launched quite recently in Mozambique. And so in general, all over the world, there's this movement called Ally. So it's actually A11Y. And 11 is the number of alphabets in the word accessibility between A and Y. I know it's a complicated explanation, but Basically, it's talking about how a lot of the times we develop websites that are not accessible to a lot of people. So people who might have seeing issues or hearing issues. So people who cannot see often have to read the whole website. And sometimes when people develop a website, they don't think about that and they use special characters or they use lots of spaces. And so when the machine is reading the website, it will read all those special characters and all those spaces. And it makes it very difficult to actually understand the content of the website. So I also see this, when people tweet, they'll use special characters. And that's very, very difficult for somebody using different types of readers to understand that content. So as much as possible, use simple language, simple content, simple coding, and then also thinking about other things like the contrast of your website. Like, for example, here, I've used a font that is slightly gray, but best practice would be that you use a font that's black so that, there's enough contrast so somebody with bad eyesight would be able to see it, or that you use large font, for example, or you use a website that's accessible on different types of phones. So there's a really lovely website that shows you all the issues that a website might have that makes it difficult for people with different types of issues to access. And of course, that's not the point, when you build something, you're not intentionally trying to exclude people because you just didn't think about it, but people do get excluded from that. So I think it's a very nice initiative that, as more people move to digital spaces, we have to think about the needs of different types of people. So I think it's a great initiative. The third one I want to share with you is a project from someone that I spoke to who works on virtual reality. So she had a project in Nairobi that was trying to understand how women might use virtual reality as a media for different things. For example, could you reimagine your city and then plan your city in a new way? That was kind of one of the examples. But when she took this device, which as you can see is quite clunky, a lot of women didn't want to use it, like they just didn't have interest. And she felt that some of the women were a bit averse to new technologies. But then some women in general didn't want it to mess up with their hair because, you have to like put all these straps and there's Velcro and people's hair gets caught in it. And so she's working on trying to make hardware that's more inclusive. So of course, when this hardware was designed, they didn't have the idea of an African woman in mind. But that doesn't mean that, people in Africa cannot design technologies or design hardware that is better suited to our needs. So I think this is a really good example of trying to make something that's inclusive, but in terms of hardware. And then just to highlight like some of the challenges. So I think this could be part of a bigger discussion, like what is holding us back in making design that is inclusive? And I think one of the big issues, of course, that holds us back in everything is funding. So I think in order to do good research, to understand your end users, you could do some for free, but then as I said, for example, if you use a digital survey, then you would miss out on people who are not connected to the internet. So in order to do good user research, you do need funding, you need resources, but it is a very vital part of building any kind of product, whether it's an organization or hardware or software. I think it's really important to understand different users and understand the needs. So one of the challenges we found in our feminist research was that a lot of organizations did not have research capacity. So they were not able to collect data. If they did, they were not able to use the data. And so I think that's one area that everyone needs to, strengthen is doing research and not just doing like monitoring and evaluation because a donor asks you to do that, but really doing user research that helps you build something that really works, like a product market fit, basically. So I would say some of the challenges are doing good research, getting the funding to do the research, to build the project, to iterate, because sometimes when you're in survival mode, you don't have time to do these different things. You're just trying to put something out there and make a living and keep the lights on and pay your staff. So it can be difficult to think about these things. So I also wish that there was funding and space for women to develop these products, to think about whether you're using feminist methodologies, whether you're building something that is built with care and equity in it. So I think, yeah, I would say resources, research resources, funding, and just time. I feel like a lot of women don't have those very vital elements that would really enable you to design something that is truly inclusive. But of course, I'd be happy to hear from you guys as well, what you think are some of the things holding us back. And yeah, I just had a last quote from John Lasseter, who was the creative director at Pixar and Walt Disney, and he's, you know, credited for making some of the animated movies that we have grown up with and grown up to love. So I like how it says the art challenges the technology and the technology inspires the art. So I'll leave it there for y'all to think about what that means in your work. And that brings me to the end. So how did I do on time? Okay.
Very efficient. No, I think you hit so many great points here, and I learned a lot. I think these are tools that can be used in any organization, especially some that maybe don't have the resources, like some of those bigger NGOs that are deploying things like Twilio and softwares that are much more expensive. So it's definitely super interesting. I wonder if any of the women here have considered design in the projects that they're doing in their communities, because I know we have a lot of leaders here that are either leading organizations or just community initiatives. So have any of you worked with design before for your projects, or have you considered design? Yeah, Rebecca?
Yes. For example, we have our organization has mobile tablet classrooms on rotation, where we go to public schools and introduce learners, primary school learners, to apps, games, audio, videos on tablets. But the challenge is that the children, since they're from public schools, are not that much exposed. So they say the content, they're not understanding what the content, because it's in English, and they want the content to be in their local language.
Yeah.
That's one of the challenges we face.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I know we're based in Morocco, do our tech, and we just wrote a manual that was actually in Moroccan Arabic, which is typically only a spoken language, like so many languages on the continent. And there's it's very political to do that rather than standard Arabic. But all of our participants said that they learned much better by reading the language that they speak. So, yeah. Have you thought, Rebecca, about writing in the local language that your students speak in?
Yes, however, it's costly. Oh, okay. Right now, we are focusing on distributing open source content that's already created. So, in order for us to create our own, that will be another process. It's contrary because we are focusing on distribution because we don't have adequate funds to create our own content. Yeah. I guess the challenge is funding still.
Yeah. Just like you were talking about, Neema.
Yeah, I think the other thing is also one of the things that came out. The other thing that came out in our research is, after we spoke to so many people, like about 50 people, and we realized that we didn't come across any feminist feminist developers, coders, for example, like women who were involved in tech, who are also embedded in feminist or women's rights organizations. So the issue might be is that there are not that many women working in tech or STEM fields, and those few who are usually get taken up by big companies. And so smaller organizations cannot afford them, they cannot hire, they're not, they just don't have enough resources to hire people at that level. So that's also one of the issues, is that there's not a good enough pipeline. And I think this is quite obvious, but there's not a good enough pipeline of women in tech or women technologists who also work at that intersection of gender and tech. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely, especially in local language. Typically, they're working in English and French rather than using the local language to implement the knowledge.
Yeah, and when they do work on that field, it's usually in academia, and then it just remains at a place that's not accessible for other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder, Rebecca, if you've thought of any strategies from what Neema shared today about how you could design differently for the people that you're working with. Yeah.
Okay, mine is just a comment. For example, our organization realized that majority of learners from public schools don't have access to alternative learning. For example, learners in private schools are able to afford, their parents are able to afford tablets, computers, personal smartphones for study, while these other learners in public schools or rural schools are not able to even afford daily lighting. So what we did was to develop the mobile tablet classrooms where we go to public schools and introduce these learners to tablet classrooms where they learn they get alternative forms of education. So that's being inclusive to those other kind of learners who are not able to afford daily power and internet or tablets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder if any of you are using technology to teach or to do your projects, and also thinking of design, how Rebecca has talked with us about.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about how people are using, what their projects are, and how design is embedded in that.
Anyone, even if you have just a general question, we'd love to hear from you guys. This is more of a conversation, so. Yeah, Zainab, you use technology in teaching. I know you have a theater association. So is it for the theater project or right? Okay. Using videos is something you talked about, Neema, for being more inclusive, is using video technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, for example, in Uganda, I don't know the case in other countries, there's different ways of embedding videos in communities that might not have access to TVs. For example, like I knew an organization that would make educational content, like short videos, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And in Uganda, we have the video halls, which are small huts or small rooms where they show different videos. And what's interesting in the way they show it in Uganda is that the movie will have somebody commentating on it in a local language. So it's not a translation, it's a commentary. So the man, it's usually a man, and the person will say, "Oh, now the actress goes into the toilet. Now she comes out and she looks at the man." And I think that's an interesting way that it's not a traditional way where people just dub some. For example, there's lots of in Germany they dub everything into German, and it's so bizarre. Yeah, even if you know German, you don't want to listen to it in German because the voices aren't right. But in this scenario, it's totally different. It's one of the few countries where I've seen such a different approach to the issue of translation. And it's also a different approach into how you bring videos to different communities. So it's not a theater per se, like it's not a cinema, but it's a small movie hall. And there's so much flexibility in how you design and use that cinema hall and what kind of content you give. And I think that's quite a different approach. And it's a nice approach that takes into account all these issues. So as I mentioned, it's accessible. People in villages can go. It's in local languages. The media is video, which really works for a lot of people. The sound is usually very loud, so anyone with seeing difficulties. And it's just tailored to the local population. It's what they like, and it's what's developed. And I think it's one really nice low-key example of how design can be done, you know, not thinking about like coding and like something super techy, but something simple like that.
Yeah, definitely. There needs to be more multilingualism now that there are the spaces that can be shared online as well. So, but you see those percentages kind of evening out now. I believe when I looked in 5 years ago or so, it was very high percentage of English content being online, and now the linguistic balance is definitely becoming more even, which is really interesting. Yeah. So Zainab brings up a good point about using projectors and different tools. Sometimes the infrastructure isn't even necessarily available. So definitely that's something that's really relevant in being able to share technology.
Yeah, like some combination of projectors and solar or batteries to reach people that, yeah, aren't connected to better infrastructure.
Yeah. I know, Josiane, you were talking earlier about how your Zoom calls were falling in and out all day, and that's definitely a setback for how you can be involved in conversations as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Josiane, did you want to say something?
Hey, yeah. So I was trying to. I think I was going to talk about. Currently, I'm doing different projects, like in stone companies. I'm also doing my own agriculture projects. But in the past, I've tried working with street kids and teen mothers on how to knit and also do art. Okay, there's a lot of background noise here because a lot of background noise here. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I think one thing I realized, a challenge that we have in Rwanda is that most of the people in the communities don't read a lot. So if you're going to teach them something, it means that to give them, maybe teach them how to see things on videos and yeah, to help them learn how to do certain things. So when we're working with the teenage mothers and the street kids, so I'll teach them how to use, like, how to watch videos on YouTube and how to teach themselves how to make different designs on what to knit, because it becomes easier that way when you can watch a video and then learn how to knit like different designs, because that helps them learn more. And right now they just knit anything. You can just watch how to knit a sweater and they'll knit it, and maybe how can I draw this, watch a YouTube video, and that became way easier. So right now I've seen many of the kids and many of the teenage mothers, they could just call me and say, oh, I made this, I watched the video. And I think that's the way we help them, like, reach that kind of technology and how to learn something by themselves without someone else having to teach them everything. So,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing.
Welcome.
I think that's super relevant. And Zainab shared a similar point where they couldn't do plays and performances during COVID, and now they're recording it for the audience so that people can watch it from home.
Cool.
Which is cool. Rebecca, did you have a point to add? Okay. Yeah, so I think with COVID now, it's even more relevant. And there's some really great stuff that's come out of it where people are able to connect from international groups. Obviously, this program itself is kind of coming out of COVID and people connecting from across the continent to discuss things. But then there's some downsides as well where maybe you can't get access to a wireless connection from your home, or the Wi-Fi isn't as good as we were talking about earlier, things like this. Have you seen any new trends, Neema, in your research during COVID and how that's impacted different groups on the continent?
Well, everything's moved to digital spaces, and I think a lot of people have had to learn how to do that. And unfortunately, people who weren't able to learn, their organizations kind of had to close down or they had to take a break, which is really unfortunate. But it's been really interesting seeing how people have moved to online spaces. Like in some ways it's a bit annoying because it's like, every meeting doesn't have to be a webinar or a call, but it's also interesting to see what people have been able to do in online spaces. I mean, the fact that, people were having weddings in video games. I mean, that wasn't in Africa, but that was a cool idea. Or having a concert in video games, or how much people have moved to platforms like TikTok and YouTube and, set up podcasts. I feel like there's been an explosion in podcasts. Like everyone has a podcast now, which is cool. I think it's such a good media to interact with people. Oh, Clubhouse, I feel like that's really, really taken off. People using, I mean, it comes back to storytelling. I think people are just tired of reading, so looking for different media, whether it's like short videos, Instagram stories, Clubhouse, and you're really seeing that younger organizations are more nimble and they're more able to use these new types of technologies. I'm not seeing it being used as much by like smaller civil society groups, but I think it's a very cool tool to reach audiences. Like if you're working, I guess especially in urban areas, because more urban people tend to use them. But if you're working with young people, it's a very interesting type of media. I think one thing that I really wish I could see is podcasts on radio. Like I never understand why radio has to be live. You could just play podcasts on the radio, and I feel like that would be really interesting as well. And maybe that's something that could be explored more.
Yeah, like mixing the mainstream with the new type of news.
Yeah.
But that's even relevant with news being on YouTube or Netflix and the mainstream kind of being its own thing as well. There's a big shift going on there with how people get their information more from independent sources now.
Yeah. Actually, it's a bit unfortunate. I just read yesterday that 4 media houses in Uganda shut down. Which is
Wow.
kind of crazy. So, I mean, in some ways it's a bit scary, but yeah, I guess more independent journalism, which opens the doors to lots of more worrying things.
Maybe you could elaborate. I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, so basically media houses across the world are supposed to, have certain ethics in how they report the news. But if you have individual freelancers as journalists, then they are not held up to the same standard. And a lot of the times they have to survive based on how many clicks they get, which then leads you to make news that is more sensationalist, or news that simply gets people to click because it's alarming or it's negative or it's demeaning, for example. And that leads to a lot of disinformation and misinformation, and it lowers the quality of journalism, and it lowers the quality of the public's trust in news and governments, and that's like a very big problem. So on one hand, it's nice to see that, there's more independent creators, but I think that some amount of ethics should be embedded. And, governments tend to overregulate in terms of these kinds of dangers. So it's important to have the conversation in like, what is the balance between independent content creators and media houses, and how do you govern and regulate that so everyone is safe and protected?
Right. It's true. I mean, and then there's a whole conversation online about safety online for women, like you were discussing a bit earlier. You touched on a little bit. So a lot to cover, especially the more we get into this digital revolution and so on. So I think we're getting close to the end, and I just wanted to be sure that there aren't any other questions from our group here that we could answer, or rather that Neema's expertise could be used for. Does anyone have questions for Neema? We'll be sharing this recording as well. I think there's a lot of really great information that people are going to circle back to. I know that I'm definitely going to check out those 3 tools that you had mentioned, and how maybe they could be used in our work even.
So
Sounds
good. And if you need any links, let me know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so Neema and I are going to stay in touch. So if anyone thinks about questions afterwards, is looking for resources or tools that you could use with the groups that you're working with in your local communities, I'll be in touch with all of you. So I guess we'll leave it at that. I'm not sure, Neema, if you want to leave us with any words of wisdom or advice or.
Yeah, I would say as much as possible, talk to your users. Even if your user is a child in primary school, definitely talk to them and understand what are their pain points, what are their challenges, what are their likes and dislikes, because the information you would get is always, always useful. So always do your market research, regardless of the age or background of whoever your user is. So thank you all for joining in, for tuning in. I hope you learned something, and always feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Neema.
See you all. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.